because Elisabeth Petrovna is an overlooked Tsarina. There's not that much research on her patronage and on her political activities. We are also interested in chinoiserie. So chinoiserie, it's art in Chinese style, produced during her reign. Her reign was truly the one of the high points of this style's development in Russia. And we were interested to see whether there are any differences in the way the style developed in Russia as opposed to the rest of the Western Europe. But first, I would like to start with giving a brief introduction about Elisabeth Petrovna. So here we can see an engraving from the collection of the Russian History Museum. So Elisabeth Petrovna came to power at the age of 31. She came to power as a result of a coup d'etat, which meant that throughout her reign, she was constantly under threat. She had to constantly reiterate the fact that her rule, she was a legitimate ruler of Russia, and she was the best ruler to rule Russia. And this is why she paid so much attention to the images. And in particular, here we can see the engraving that she chose to serve as a image that she wanted to send all of Russia and Europe to represent her, because she wasn't happy with the images produced by other artists at the time. So this was supposed to be the example the other artists were meant to base the images of herself. And what it shows is that she's a very confident ruler. She is full of energy, she's full of power, and she's also a peaceful ruler. Here we can see a palm tree. Then here we can see a laurel tree, so she's aiming to be a victorious ruler as well. So she's trying to bring Russia both peace but also victories in war. This image, and this is also from the collection of the Russian History Museum. This fascinating book is a Bible. So Peter the Great, her father, in the beginning of the 18th century, commissioned to translate a Bible into the Church Slavonic. This project was quite complex, and it required cross-checking the translation with versions of the Bible from Europe and previous editions. And it took so long that it was completed after his death. So the project was neglected until Elisabeth came to power, and she restarted the project. So Elisabeth came to power. As a result of a coup d'etat. The person who was meant to rule Russia was imprisoned. His name was Ivan IV. He was put into the Schlüsselburg fortress, and his life was very sad because he was imprisoned as a child. And he was kept in solitary confinement since childhood, which meant that he had, issues with his health and mental health. However, his life, there was nothing threatening his life, and he was unfortunately murdered during the reign of Catherine the Great, who perceived him as a threat, and he eventually was murdered. So this image at the beginning of the book shows us that Elisabeth claimed her legitimacy through her connection to her father, Peter the Great. We can see him at the top of the page. This is him as a young warrior giving her a palm tree, symbol of peace. Next to him, we can see Elisabeth's mother, Empress Catherine I. So after Peter the Great's father died, after Peter the Great died, he nominated Catherine I to be the ruler after him, and she ruled Russia just for a few years, and then her death started this period of coup d'etats in Russia, and period of instability. But this was a period when women could rule Russia as well. As we can see, Catherine I is giving symbols of power to Elisabeth. Elisabeth is shown in the garden. We can see in the background palm trees, again, symbols of peace, So during this time, a garden was a very powerful symbol. It was considered to be a kind of microcosm, a symbol of heaven on earth. So Tsarina was meant to create a copy of the paradise on earth. And this is her promise to the citizens of Russia, that she's going to recreate the heaven on earth in Russia through investment in art and culture. And this is another item from the museum's collection. This is a goblet made of glass. It represents Elisabeth surrounded by military symbols. Here we can see some military, this is the flags, there's the cannons here. So, you know, women could rule Russia, so that was okay, but every female ruler had to articulate and show that they had masculine characteristics, and war was one of the ways that women could show that they had it in them to rule Russia as a state. So this is why there are a lot of images of Elisabeth Petrovna in military uniform, Elisabeth Petrovna as had to dress in military and male clothing for masquerades. And here we can see Elisabeth, the cup with Elisabeth, again, referring to her as a military leader, because that, you know, gave her extra power and extra legitimacy. Also, Elisabeth Petrovna was a mercantilist ruler. She believed that Russia needs to produce luxury goods within its borders. It believed that it can make a lot more money by creating its own luxury goods like porcelain, glass, silks, and so on. So her government imposed very high taxes on luxury goods coming from China, for example. So they imported a lot of raw silk, a lot of materials for production of lacquer panels, and this and she kind of established the Academy of Science, Academy of Art, to guide the design of this luxury items, so that Russia becomes a powerhouse producing sophisticated goods for the European market, and becomes a successful producer of this. And this glass goblet is a good example of that strategy and the success of that strategy. So this is Elisabeth Petrovna. So Elisabeth Petrovna succeeded in the war against Frederick the Great, which was quite an achievement for the time, and Russian troops even entered Berlin for the moment. So that was at the end of the 7-Year War. However, she died shortly after, and Peter III came to power, Emperor Peter III, and he gave back all the lands to Frederick the Great. So this image portrays her as this military leader. So all Russian female rulers like Catherine the Great and Elisabeth had to keep reminding the population that they are successful military leaders. So Elisabeth Petrovna came to power in 1742, and the coronation ceremony took place in Kremlin, and she was the coronation was crowned on the throne that came from Persia. So this was a diplomatic gift. Quite a fascinating diplomatic gift, because it was created in Isfahan in Iran, in Persia. It's decorated with diamonds, and it was commissioned by Armenian merchants because they wanted to establish favorable trading conditions with Russia. So they gave this throne to Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich in 1660, and this throne features saints, Orthodox saints, 2-headed eagle. There are 2 angels here as well, but it also features elephants, little Persian miniatures of flowers. So it's a truly cross-cultural object, representing Russia as a country at the crossroads of 2 cultures. And this is what Elisabeth tried to articulate. When she came to power, this was one of her messages. She was saying, previous reign of Anna Ioannovna, Empress Anna Ioannovna, was too Europe-focused. She was claiming that we need to focus more on Russia, and the way to focus on Russia is to look at Asia as well as a trading partner, as a as a diplomatic partner, and so on. So there was a lot more interest in Asia during her reign. However, she was still very interested in Europe as well. So Elisabeth Petrovna, during her reign, art in Chinese style truly flourished in Russia. Art in Chinese style came to Russia from Europe. So here we can see a painting by Francois Boucher, shows Chinese fishing. So European art in Chinese style represented China primarily as a peaceful state where people are living in harmony with nature. They fish, they drink tea, they have some funny occurrences. So this style represented China as a very peaceful state, but it also was considered to be kind of whimsical and superficial, and also connected with women very often, and sometimes women were criticized for their interest in this style. So in Europe, there was this tension between representing China as a space of wisdom, as a place where Confucius lived, and a lot of European plays were set in China, and that was done to sometimes even show China as a superior state to Europe. So now, 18th century is the time of cosmopolitanism, the time where interest in other cultures was very strong, and this is why China was kind of revered so much and respected a lot. Russian relationship with China was a little bit different because, Europe primarily dealt with China in two ways. So China was a trading partner, and trading was conducted through cantons. So the majority of merchants were not allowed to enter Beijing. There were also Jesuit monks there as well, and even European artists teaching Chinese artists as well. So there was quite a lot of exchange as well. In Russian case, Russia bordered China. There was a long border, which meant that the countries kind of eyed each other's territories. Both states were empires. Both had territorial ambitions. So throughout the 18th century, Russia was the only state that hosted several embassies from China. Interestingly, both embassies came during the reign of Anna Ioannovna, and we're going to talk about it in a minute. But this beautiful map shows a part of Russia, and this is a Russian camp, military camp. So there was some disquiet in Russia about China because they knew that they didn't have very large army on the border with China, and if China actually wanted to invade, there wouldn't be much stopping them. So this image represents a Chinese view of Russian camp. As you can see, there's a lot of order, but there's not many people. This is a beautiful river with merchant vessels going up and down the river. There's peasants here as well. So this all the maps or representing border territories, they're very political at the time, and they are very much about spying and learning about the other side, and they're also about territorial ambitions. So both countries were eyeing each other's territories, but at the same time, they wanted to establish good relationships and stable relationships. Peter the Great sent several embassies to China, and this established, this is one of them. This was sent to China at the end of the 17th century. This particular embassy was a disaster because the Chinese emperor considered himself to be at the center of the known world. So other states, basically any other embassy coming to China, was treated as, that they were bringing tributes to China, that they were dependent on China in some way. So when Russian embassy came, and this is Russian embassy shown in Beijing, they angered him, the Chinese emperor, because they, in the official papers, the name of the Russian Tsar, the names of the Russian Tsars went first, they went before the name of Chinese Tsar, Chinese emperor. So, this embassy traveled to China for 2 years. A lot of people died on the way. It was a very hard journey, and they didn't spend much time in China, unfortunately, and they had to travel back with not much to show for it, because Chinese emperor was not impressed with that. He considered himself offended. So Russia and China had to learn a lot about each other, because there was quite a lot of tension in terms of diplomatic relationships. However, this particular trip was a success from the knowledge creation perspective. Russia became a leader in knowledge production about China, and this book appeared. So, quite a few members of that embassy published books and maps about China. So, in terms of knowledge production, that was a very fruitful trip. So, as I mentioned, there were 2 embassies from China that came to Russia during the reign of Anna Ioannovna. And the reason behind this strong interest, and the fact that this was the only time in the 18th century when Chinese ambassadors actually kowtowed in front of the foreign leader, was the fact that China needed Russian support in their war against Jungaria. Jungarians were a Central Asian nation, quite a large nation, and Chinese wanted to conquer it. And they wanted Russia either to support them in that, or they wanted Russia to abstain and don't make things worse. And this is why they sent 2 embassies to Anna Ioannovna. They sent a lot of gifts. Another reason for their visit was that they wanted the Kalmyk people to come back to China. So these Kalmyks were nomadic tribes, and they migrated to Russia because they wanted more freedom. However, over time, their relationship with Russia soured, because every year they got less and less land. And eventually they migrated back to China during the reign of Catherine the Great. And this was a tragic event for the Kalmyk people, because a lot of them perished during the journey. So, Russia and China were separated by many deserts, dangerous rivers. So the trip between the 2 states was not, it was quite hard and challenging. So Elisabeth Petrovna saw one of the embassies when the ambassadors came to St. Petersburg. They came, and Elisabeth was in the audience at the time, and she remembered that during that audience, the Chinese were asked, what was the most interesting aspect of Russia that you've seen? And they said that the fact that women are everywhere. You can see women in the gardens, in the parks, and also we have never seen a woman on the throne. So that was what impressed them. But then they were asked, who is the most beautiful woman in the audience? Probably hoping that they would name Anna Ioannovna. And they named Elisabeth Petrovna, who was at the time 21, in 22, anyway, in the early 20s. And this was significant because at the time she was marginalized by Anna Ioannovna. Anna Ioannovna did not like Elisabeth very much, did not give her a lot of money to maintain her court. So this was quite significant for Elisabeth Petrovna, that she was singled out by Chinese ambassadors, and she maintained this soft spot for Chinese people and for Chinese emperor until her death. And throughout her reign, she sent couriers to China to entice the Chinese emperor to send embassy to Russia to acknowledge her legitimacy and to acknowledge that she's a well-respected leader. However, by the time she came to power, Chinese emperor lost interest in Russia because the Hungarians were conquered. That was a tragic event as well. A lot of them died. And the Chinese emperor no longer felt the need in sending embassies to Russia. So when the ambassadors stayed in St. Petersburg, there was a special order made that the Chinese need to be fed from porcelain items made in Europe, not China, but specifically they had to be fed from plates and cups created in Europe, which meant at the time only plates made in Meissen, because this was the first factory, the first place in Europe that figured out how to create porcelain in Europe. That happened in the early 18th century under the reign of Augustus the Strong. And this was so important because, Chinese people were pressuring Russia to help them in their war, and this was a way for Anna Ioannovna to say that Russia does not want to be involved in the wars of others. Russia wants to be a neutral power, and by showing the Chinese people chinoiserie items made in Europe, she was saying that I can procure my goods where I want, in Europe or in Asia, and I don't want to be involved in this war. This is set in the chinoiserie style, which was given to Elisabeth Petrovna in the 20s. So Elisabeth was very young. This gift was actually meant for Peter the Great. It was an exchange for exotic animals sent to Augustus the Strong. But by the time the set was made, Peter the Great died, and the gift came to Elisabeth. Again, it was a very special gift, and Elisabeth loved small miniatures depicting Chinese people in it. They were quite funny and entertaining. So before Elisabeth came to power, knowledge production about China was primarily centered around the Kunstkammer. The Kunstkammer was the first museum in Russia. It was opened by Peter the Great. Most people dressed in good clothes could enter that museum. It wasn't just a museum. So here we can see the museum part of the building. This is an elephant, these are horses. So this is where the displays were situated. This is a hot tub globe that was brought from Germany. A large section of the Kunstkammer was occupied by the Academy of Sciences. And the Academy of Sciences was funded by the court at the time. And to make sure that the Academy of Sciences received regular funding and then the scholars are paid, the Academy of Sciences aimed to be useful. And they decided that to be useful, they need to create a paper catalogue of the Kunstkammer's collection, which was a very good decision because soon after there was a fire in the Kunstkammer and a lot of items perished. And we know of their existence now because of this paper museum, this wonderful catalogue that took quite a lot of years to produce. It was meant to be published in Europe, but the publication never eventuated, unfortunately. But now we have this wonderful resource. The section dedicated to Chinese item numbers 240 sheets. As you can see, these are watercolors and the items from their collections. So the collection came from Peter the Great and his friends, Count Bruce and Alexander Menshikov. So these were the items that came to Russia through the embassies, but also were purchased by them from Europe. So it was a mixture of items. They were pictured against the white background. This was a way, even plants were depicted at the time, and the idea was that you can, take items and reconfigure them. So this paper catalog was used as a way of showcasing items from the Kunstkammer collection that courtiers could borrow for their masquerades and balls, because the catalog featured clothing as well. And also it served as a way to produce knowledge about China. and also promote items that Russian caravans could bring from China. So some of the items have actually survived, and this we are very lucky. And this is a moon flask that survived, and this is a watercolor image version created by Alexei Grekov in '36. And as you can see, the two images are slightly different. For example, in Alexei Grekov's watercolor, the background is green, whereas in the original, the background is blue, light blue. So you can see that Alexei Grekov tried to make chinoiserie Chinese items more European, and more easy to understand, more illusionistic, whereas in China it's more abstract. He also when depicting plants, for example, he tried to make color contrast more harmonious. Here we can see quite a strong contrast between yellow and red. In his watercolor, it's much more harmonious, much more pleasant to the eye, to European eye. So the works themselves are very often placed in their symmetrical arrangement, which is not really the way the Chinese items were designed. So again, it's a big project of cultural translation, trying to make China understandable for the Russian audiences. So speaking of caravan trade, so a lot of goods at the Russian port from China, they came via the caravan trade. This is an image of Kyakhta, which is a town on the border with China where a lot of the trade was conducted. So every several years, the trade was conducted in Beijing. Russian merchants were allowed to enter Beijing, and on other years, the trade was conducted in Kyakhta or other border towns. So even though the accounts show that caravans trade was not profitable, sometimes was even a loss maker, Russian emperors and empresses still funded caravan trade with China, because this was a way of exchanging animal pelts, which was Russian main resource in the 17th century, for precious metals, for gold and silver, which were imported to Russia and used to replace the debased coins. So that was the Russian government received pelts as a way of taxation, taxing the nations that were in Siberia that were conquered during the previous centuries. They were kept in storage in Kyakhta, in Siberia, but also in Moscow, and then the caravans would bring them to China in exchange for goods like tea, porcelain, and other items, but also just pure silver and gold. So, and Elisabeth Petrovna was famous for visiting the caravans. So after their arrival to cities, she would go and pick the best goods for her palace. So this is her portrait, and here we can see that she's pointing at a vase looks like Japanese vase. So porcelain was actually very important for Elisabeth Petrovna, and she sought legitimacy. She articulated that she was a legitimate ruler in Russia by saying that thanks to her efforts, Russia created its own porcelain. So porcelain, the secret of porcelain production was at the time in Europe considered that if you manage to find out the secret and you know how to turn basic base elements and turn them into beautiful porcelain, this means that your rule was divinely blessed. And this is why porcelain was so really important to her. But her success is based on the activities of her predecessor, Anna Ioannovna, who sent Russian students who conducted kind of spy missions, industrial espionage, on her behalf. But they arrived back in Russia with these secrets in 43 and 46. One of them translated the treatise on porcelain. Another one talked to porcelain producers in Chintachen, where the porcelain factories were based, and they brought these secrets to Russia, hoping that this would help Elisabeth Petrovna. They set up a factory in Tsarskoye Selo near Elisabeth Petrovna's summer palace. And however, this first attempt was a bit of a disaster. The thing is, they kind of didn't notice that the secret for porcelain needs to include feldspar, and they didn't use it, and hence the first Russian porcelain was not very good. It took several attempts. However, soon in 1947, the first Russian cups were produced, and we'll talk about it shortly. So Elisabeth Petrovna, as I mentioned, she articulated her legitimacy to rule through the references to her father. This is the first interior, one of the first interiors in Chinese style that she designed for her palace in Tsarskoye Selo. Was strongly influenced by the lacquer interiors designed for Peter the Great, one of which was in the Montplaisir Palace, but there were others. The difference between Peter the Great's interiors and Elisabeth's interiors lay in the focus, the shift in focus. So Peter the Great's interiors were focused on lacquer panels. Here, all the focus is on porcelain. In fact, there were more than 600 items. Most of them came from Peter the Great's collection. Others came from Saxony, from Japan. So there was three kind of porcelain producing countries represented here: China, Japan, and Saxony. And in the middle of the hall, Elisabeth Petrovna placed Russian porcelain. So the room invited people to compare and contrast Russian porcelain and its successes with the best porcelain from Japan, China, and Saxony. Also, the room, as you can see, there's an inscription on the map, on the plan, and it says that lacquer panels were inspired by the chinoiserie produced by the Emperor Peter the Great. So she really strongly highlighted the idea that even chinoiserie interiors based on Peter the Great's example. So the walls were decorated with lacquer panels, but they were also decorated with large sections of mirrors. And what mirrors created, endless reflections, endless shadows and reflections. So which produced in the people's imagination the idea of copying, and that copying is okay, and Russia is this wonderful producer that copied the porcelain secrets both from China and Germany, from Meissen. So they also hired a person from Meissen factory, and eventually this kind of combination of two secrets created Russian porcelain, which it's made out of, it's different. Russian porcelain is different to European porcelain because some of its makeup comes from China. And another interesting aspect of this room is these two Chinese boys who look a bit forlorn, so possibly they're a bit upset that Russia finally in 1740s, managed to discover the secret of porcelain production and join the ranks of other porcelain producing nations like France and Germany. So this is where these students lived when they stayed in Beijing. This is kind of this is where the caravan stayed as well. So every few years when they came to Beijing, they stayed on the premises. This is the monastery. And this is also where the couriers who were sent to China by Elisabeth Petrovna, this is where they stayed. So this is one of the first cup created by Vinogradov in 1747. As you can see, it's very far from being perfect. There's a long way to go. It's small, it's misshapen, there's a lot of dark spots. But soon, Russia expanded its production. So Russian porcelain production was not economically viable as well. So it required a lot of money and wasn't profitable. It was primarily producing porcelain for the court, and it was a way of promoting the prestige of Russia. And this is an early map showing the Nevsky porcelain factory, where the production, so it was based on the bank of the Neva River, and this is where all these beautiful items were fired. In 57, they finally designed a large kiln for producing large vases. So these are some of the first porcelain items created in the Nevsky porcelain factory, and they show us influence of both direct Chinese influence, but also chinoiserie, influence of chinoiserie from Europe. So, for example, this dog and this cow that really look like very Chinese. There's these cups, the images on these cups, they come from engravings by Clément, who was a French designer who worked in chinoiserie style. So there was the Imperial porcelain producers, they were getting the influence from both countries, from both sides, from Europe and Asia. This is another example of the early vase, one of the first vases. It was produced by Müller, who was hired, who used to work for the Meissen factory. And this early vase, it shows a kind of influence of European porcelain, but here we can see that these flowers and these branches, they really show influence of China. So this really mixture of influences. One of the unique types of chinoiserie produced in Russia at the time were the snuff boxes made out of shells. So these were quite special shells. They were called turban shells because they looked very oriental. They were procured in the Pacific Ocean. They were collected by the Chinese merchants who brought them to China. And this is where they were used to create Chinese wine cups. So here we can see that quite a lot of these vessels had inscriptions in Chinese that kind of wished you happiness while you drink your wine. Then these wine cups were sent to Russia, to Veliki Ustuk in the northern part of Russia. It's a region where silversmiths are very famous, and there's a lot of them. And this is where they repurposed these wine cups. They cut them and added silver leads in yellow, using yellow technique, or sometimes they added golden leads, and turned them, these wine cups, into snuff boxes. So, shells in Europe symbolized, the searching for wisdom within you. But the fact that they were used either as wine glasses or as snuff boxes kind of poked fun. So these were playful snuff boxes that were saying, sometimes it's good just to have fun and have time, enjoy life in the moment. So Elisabeth Court was famous for their love of entertainments, for their love of having a good time. And these snuff boxes were quite popular. Also, we know that the first porcelain, for a while people thought that porcelain is made out of ground shells, and those snuff boxes were displayed on the same table next to different porcelain items, and that looked, some of them that some of the first Russian porcelain items were made to look like shells. So they created this comparison between Russian porcelain and other Russian chinoiserie items made out of shells. So there were interesting comparisons that created. And these shells really drove and promoted the idea that Russia is this land between Europe and Asia that bordered both territories. There were poems created at this time that promoted the fact that Russian leaves extended to China, but Russian head was in Europe, and basically this was a way for Elisabeth to highlight the idea that in that aspect she was continuing the ideas of her father. And here we can see a letter written by Leibniz to Peter the Great, in which he was saying that Russian Academy of Sciences is uniquely situated at the crossroads between Asia and Europe, and it can combine the achievements of Asian, Chinese science and European science. So there was this interest in combining the two. So Russian snuff boxes, they were decorated with lids, either in chinoiserie style, but also sometimes they were based on engravings from Europe. And here we can see a lid that was inspired by an engraving by Jacques de la Joux. It's called Shipwreck. And it was, again, a way of promoting Russian trade, caravan trade, as opposed to perilous journey by the sea. Russian caravan trade didn't have to go via the ocean, hence there's no risk of shipwreck. So it was another way of Elisabeth Petrovna promoting this unique opportunity to have a direct engagement with China over the land. So as you can see, a lot of the time chinoiserie items were used by Elisabeth Petrovna to promote herself and her ideas. And this set really showcases that. This is a set of 10 figurines produced by the Imperial, by the Nevsky Porcelain Factory in the 50s, so towards the end of her reign. There are 10 of them, and they were all dressed in Oriental costumes. They're called the Chinese. We don't yet know what they represent. For a while, people thought that these are ambassadors, but actually, at the moment, scholars think that they are either actors dressed in Oriental costumes, probably borrowed from the Kunstkammer, or they are courtiers dressed in Oriental costumes, ready to go to a masked ball, which were very popular at the time as well. And during this period, Elisabeth invested large sums of money into plays, stage plays, because they helped to promote her and her ideas and really make them popular. And plays in Chinese style were quite popular at the time. If you will look closely at the figurines, we notice that men from this set, they tend to have their hands in sleeves, they look up, so they look quite passive. Whereas women in the set, they tend to have their hands raised up, they're calling to action, they're quite active. So this was Elisabeth's way of articulating her power and saying that through playful, through plays, but also through sculptures, to promote the idea that she's a legitimate ruler, women have the right to rule Russia. Another interesting aspect of this set is that there's some statues here that have a kind of ambiguous gender identity. So here, for example, we have a person dressed in masculine dress, but it also has a lot of feminine features. So we don't really know. There's an ambiguity about this gender. And this statue is dressed in female clothes and has a female body of a female that's calling to action, but it also features a moustache. So through this gender ambiguity, playful gender ambiguity, Elisabeth again drove forward the idea that women, gender is less important. It's who you are what is important, and this was a playful way of promoting her right to rule Russia. So this is a close-up of the set, and we can see that the statues have, these figurines have very delicate facial features. This is close-ups of male from this set, and as you can see, they also have quite delicate facial features. So there's a lot of playfulness in this set, and we have to understand that during this time, the Orient in general and China in particular was considered to be a safe space for women in Europe, especially in Britain. Women bought Chinese porcelain to articulate their identities, to promote their agendas. So Oriental spaces were considered to be friendly, and Elisabeth Petrovna took advantage of that to promote in a playful way her, identity. So to sum up, so Russian chinoiserie was influenced by direct encounters with China, through ambassadorial activities, through encountering with Chinese people, through trade as well, and having access to porcelain items and knowledge from China, both from Europe and to Asia, and through caravan trade. Russian, at the same time, Russian chinoiserie tells us quite a lot, not just about Russian relationship with China, but also about Russian court and what was going on at the court. And also, it was primarily focused on Elisabeth Petrovna and her articulation of her power. So, and again, these items, they articulate the ambiguity of Russian relationship with Asia. From one point of view, Elisabeth wanted to have a friendly relationship with the Chinese emperor. She kept sending ambassadors there, but at the same time, we can see in the letters from that period that Russia was actually interested in acquiring some of the lands along the border. So it's the same with Russian chinoiserie, Russian Orientalism. At this point, it's quite ambiguous. There's a lot of interest in studying, in admiring China, but at the same time, there's also an attempt to represent China as other. And we know that Russia has this double identity. It's both in Europe and Asia. So Russia was kind of couldn't decide what its rightful place was. It was both in Russia, and it tried to kind of gain access to both Europe and Asia and flourish through exchange of ideas and trade. And if you are interested in the complexities of China and chinoiserie in Russia, there's a few publications that I would like to recommend. There's two publications by Jennifer Milam, which are accessible through her academia.edu web page. There's also a wonderful chapter by David Schinkelmink, Ekaterina chinoiserie, and a recent book by Gregory Afinogenov, which talks about the political connections between Russia and China, and also knowledge transfer between the two states. And yeah, this research will be published hopefully this month, but maybe next month, as a chapter in a book called Russian Orientalism in a Global Context, which will talk about the fact that, the Russian relationship with Asia, Russian relationship with the East changed throughout its existence. 18th century is the time where this relationship is not yet stable. Asia is not the other yet. Asia is still something that Russia is actually interested in and wants to learn more about. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't think there was a single source. Elisabeth Petrovna collected, I think, quite a lot of her items during her visits to the caravan. So when the caravans arrived back to Russia, she was the first. So they had to show their best pieces in her palaces, and this is where she took the best objects of what she liked. Then there was another source, was a collection of her father that came down to her, and she also acquired quite a few items from Europe as well. So there was not a single, she kind of picked and chose what she liked. And she had a lot of palaces. She built a lot of palaces. They all needed, so during any given time, there were quite a lot of interiors in chinoiserie style that existed simultaneously. Even in Tsarskaya Selo, there were three. Just in her palaces, there were also palaces of Peter III, which also featured chinoiserie interiors, quite a lot of them as well. So they needed a lot of decoration in that style. Unfortunately, because a lot of that decoration was quite fragile, because of the climate, a lot of palaces and interiors didn't survive because of moisture, unfortunately. So this is why I show you a lot of objects of applied art rather than photographs from actual spaces, because unfortunately they didn't survive due to wars, but also because of moisture. Most of them were destroyed by the 19th century, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now, Carolyn has an inquiry about collecting and its influence and asks, did Elisabeth's art collection influence Catherine the Great's later art acquisitions in any way?
Yeah, good question. I think so. Because, Elisabeth can really started that trend of restarted that trend of interest in Orientalism and chinoiserie in particular, and Catherine definitely tried to outdo Elisabeth. So I think she was, quite a strong influence on Catherine, who saw these interiors, saw Elisabeth's passion for China, and their relationship between two of them was not very friendly. They were kind of competing. Elisabeth didn't get on with Catherine very much, and Catherine felt probably the need to, after Elizabeth's death, to outdo her, and she built her first palace in chinoiserie style pretty much straight after that, after Elizabeth's death. So there was an element of competition there, definitely. And also, I forgot, she actually recycled quite a lot of objects and panels from Elizabeth's interior. So the Chinese chinoiserie interior that I showed to you, that was designed by Rastrelli, Catherine the Great destroyed it when she came to power, and she started rebuilding the Tsarskaya Selo Palace. And some of these panels and some of the porcelain were used and recycled for Catherine the Great's own Chinese halls. So yes, some of those items were repurposed for Catherine's purposes.
All right. Lena would like to know, when did travel to China become more frequent? When did some of these exchanges take place?
So this, during the 18th century, travel to China was quite regular. Every 2 years, a caravan left Russia, but the journey was quite long. But every 2 years there was an arrival of caravan into Moscow or St. Petersburg with new goods, with new news, because caravan was also a way of transporting scholarly information, letters from China. So that was quite regular, and students but also priests traveled to China with caravans. So that was quite a regular occurrence, and it became more and more frequent as the century progressed. But it was still quite perilous and long, unfortunately. So it wasn't something you would do it wasn't like a grand tour. It wasn't a pleasurable trip. It was quite long and exciting, but also quite perilous. So I would say every 2 years there was a caravan leaving China.
Thank you. Now, Conrad would like to know, you detail a little bit of this perilous journey, and of course, a lot of these items are in palaces, but he asks, how accessible was Russian Oriental porcelain to, let's say, middle-class Russians?
Oh, unfortunately, not very. And Elizabeth didn't. So Russian czars during this period were not that interested in the middle classes anyway. So they promoted themselves for the aristocracy, because aristocracy and the nobility held the keys to power. They were the ones they had to who could basically replace the Tsar. So this is why they had to keep the nobility happy. And Russia didn't have very large middle class. In contrast to Western Europe, Russia didn't have very large middle class. The majority of its population was peasants who were working very hard and didn't really have much time for art appreciation. So the palaces were primarily targeted towards the court and the aristocracy. And this was a prime target for Elisabeth propaganda. This is who she had to convince that she was a legitimate ruler. So the aristocracy and the guards regiments, who were the upper echelons of the army.
All right, thank you. So we still have a few moments. If anyone has any last-minute questions for our presenter, please do submit them into the chat. And while you are doing so, if I may ask, just give us a little bit more information about your upcoming publication. It's fascinating content and material that you are working on. So could you explain a little bit more about this volume, which will soon be published, maybe next month, maybe the month after?
Do you mean the Russian Orientalism or the
Yes.
one of the garden? So Russian Oriental. So this publication is based on a conference, CAA conference that was held in New York in 2018. The panel was created by Maria Tarutina and Alison Lee, and quite a lot of people presented their papers on various aspects of Russian Orientalism from 18th century and finishing with the 20th century. And basically the main idea behind this volume is that Russia had a different type of Orientalism to European Orientalism, because half of its, or more than a half of its territory was considered to be, the Orient Asia at the time. So you can't have the same relationship and can't articulate its relationship to Asia in the same way. And so the volume looks at the way the Orient is, the changing relationship to the Orient throughout the time. So of course 19th century was the time when Russia started its colonial wars, and a lot of its representations about the East being the other, which was quite common trend in Europe at the time. If you want to conquer a territory, you need to represent it as the other, as something that is a territory that is inferior to you in terms of intelligence, in terms of your emotions, and so on. So there was a lot of that, but not only, because, as I said, Russia is part Asian as well, and a lot of its this is the complexity of it. And actually, in our own chapter, we mentioned that during the 18th century, Russia thought of itself as Asian. There was this element of self-orientalization, and the poems by Derzhavin and some other poets represent, situate Russia in Asia. So, for example, Derzhavin wrote a poem called Tufilitsa, and he called Catherine the Great the Tsarina of Kyrgyz Kaisatsky horde, which is a Central Asian tribe, and it's basically situated Russia in the Middle East. So that was quite unique to Russia at the time, that it's represented itself as an Asian state in a playful way. But Derzhavin himself was of Tatar origin, so there's not Russian relationship with Asia was quite complex and nuanced, and the volume showcases that, shows it how it was happening in the 19th century and also in the 20th century.
Wonderful, thank you. So we actually do have a few more inquiries from the audience. This one has to do with interior style. Philippe asks, is there anything about the Rococo that you think might have appealed to Russian audiences specifically?
Yeah, very interesting. I think they like the fact that it's quite light-hearted, it's quite festive, and Elizabeth was notorious for her interest in parties. So they were having, regular parties. Large sums of money were spent on entertainments on a grand scale, which also had propaganda purposes as well. So they loved that aspect, but also they loved the shell decoration. And we've seen during that lecture that shells were quite special. For Elisabeth Petrovna, and it's quite a feature of the Rococo style. That the whole idea that the shell was important for her because it had that intellectual component. It's about thinking. It's about comparing Russian porcelain to shells, but also it's artwork made by nature, and this is why it was quite popular in Russia. I'm not sure why else it was popular. I think also these interiors were considered to be spaces of relaxation and spaces of escape. And for example, Peter III, who came to power after Elizabeth, when he only ruled Russia for 6 months, but when his turn to be arrested, and he knew that he is going to be arrested, he went to an interior in Chinese style and waited there for his fate. So he, at the time, these interiors were ways of escaping the danger, escaping the stress. You can imagine that life in the Russian court was quite perilous and stressful. And it was typical to treat those interiors as ways of kind of windows to the other world. And I think that aspect was quite popular.
Sure, thank you. Elena would like to know, when did Russia start making bone porcelain? How was this technology developed?
Well, good question. I'm not sure. Good question. I'm not quite sure. I would say in the 18th century, because that, porcelain is very fine. That was produced during, the end of 18th century. But I'm not quite sure. So I'm sorry. I don't know.
Sure. All right. And Catherine would like to know a little bit more about the purchasing and sale of these items, kind of from the manufacturer's standpoint, if we could call it that. She would like to know, were they made per order, or was there already items available for sale that Elizabeth would, let's say, go and pick out and say, oh, I'd like this one or that one?
Thank you for this question. I think from what we know, the relationship between the court and the factory were quite close. So she supervised, so there's quite a lot of letters between her and the factory in which she really supervises the delivery of porcelain sets. And she's, urges them to work faster and harder. So I think she knew what was being produced, and she picked and chose the best items of interest for her own interiors. So I think for her it was really important, and that was her baby, her creation. So she supervised it quite strongly, and the factory did not produce that many items, so it was all produced for the court. So either for her or for Peter III or for Catherine the Great, or for the young court of the young czars. So it was there weren't that many objects produced at the time. There was no consumer market. It was not sold outside the court.
All right, thank you. So that is all for the question and answer session. Thank you again for taking the time with our audience to address these inquiries. I would like to note that we will have another lecture next month about another Elizabeth, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, and the Martha and Mary Convent. We will be in touch with the audience by way of email and our website. Early next week, registration should be open for next month's event. But for now, let's give another round of virtual applause for today's presenter. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for an enlightening presentation. And one final thank you to all attendees. Hope everyone has a good rest of the weekend, and we will hopefully see you next time. Bye, everyone.